Sales of electric cars hit 6.6 million in 2021, more than tripling their market share from only 2 years earlier. It's predicted that 7 million EVs will be sold in China this year alone, eclipsing the entire global figure for 2021. Hello, my friends, and welcome to the Electric Viking. My name is Sam Evans. I'm coming to you here from Melbourne, Australia. Welcome to all the new subscribers. Great to have you guys. Welcome back to everyone else. If you're new, or even if you're not new, make sure you check out some of the 800 videos we've created over the last 6 months. In there are my predictions on what will happen in the future based on thousands and thousands of hours of research. Now, for the guy saying that my opinions or my facts are not relevant because I only have a marketing degree, well, yeah, just go watch someone else's videos, mate. Who cares? It doesn't matter. I don't think anyone cares about that fact. Realistically, what matters is the content. Now, in the world of clean energy, few areas are as dynamic as the electric car market. In the whole of 2012, about 130,000 electric cars were sold worldwide. Today, that many are sold in one single week. Think about it. 130,000. Right? Back in 2012. Only 9 years later, that becomes 6.6 million. 1 year after that, what will it be? 14 million this year? Maybe. It's very possible. After that, well, I believe we have hit that point in the S-curve where we come to what's known as the tipping point. Growth has been particularly impressive over the last 3 years, even as the global pandemic shrank the market for conventional cars and as manufacturers started grappling with supply chain bottlenecks. In 2019, 2.2 million electric cars were sold, representing only 2.5% of global car sales. In 2020, the overall car market contracted, but electric car sales bucked the trend, rising to 3 million and representing 4.1% of total car sales. In 2021, electric car sales more than doubled to 6.6 million, representing close to 9% of the global car market and more than tripling their market share from only 2 years earlier. All the net growth in global car sales in 2021 came from one type of car, electric cars. The crazy thing is, this year, Tesla will likely sell about 1.8 million EVs. In other words, Tesla alone will sell nearly as many electric cars as the entire world sold in 2020. The IEA estimates that there are now around 16 million electric cars on the road worldwide. And they say they're consuming roughly 30 terawatt hours of electricity per year. That's the equivalent of all the electricity generated in Ireland. Electric cars helped avoid oil consumption and CO2 emissions in 2021. Although these benefits were cancelled out by the parallel increase in the sales of SUVs. So because people are buying bigger cars, they're using more fuel, unfortunately. Electric car sales tend to be higher later on in the year. In 2021, December sales were more than 2.5 times as high as sales in January in the top 3 markets in the world, still over the course of 2021. Monthly electric car sales were consistently at least 50% higher than the corresponding month in 2020. Who is leading? China and Europe. The People's Republic of China led global growth in electric car markets in 2021 as sales tripled to 3.4 million alone. In other words, more electric cars were sold in 2021 in China alone than was sold in the entire world in 2020. The IEA says the annual increase is the fastest electric car market growth in China since 2015, significantly outpacing the more gradual recovery of the country's overall car market and displacing sales of legacy automakers in China. Electric cars' share of the overall market on a monthly basis leaped from 7.2% in January to 20% in December. And that's purely electric cars, not plug-in hybrids, purely electric. The Chinese government's official target is for more electric cars to reach a market share to hit 20% or more for the full year in 2025. Their performance in 2021 suggests they're on track to hit that number this year. In particular, if you look at China's electric car sales in January, well, they've already hit 20% in January. What are we going to hit in December? Could be 30, 35%. Several factors underpin the market's dynamism. The government extended electric car subsidies for a further 2 years after the pandemic broke out, albeit with a planned reduction of 10% in 2021 and 30% in 2022. However, they've taken the cap off the number of vehicles. So the actual subsidies given out will actually increase this year compared to last year, especially when you consider the fact that electric car sales could potentially double again this year. The growth in 2021 sales, despite the scaled-back subsidies, suggests China's EV market has started to mature, as has been said by many observers around the world. But it also could reflect an overheated rush by customers to secure subsidies in 2021 levels before they declined at the start of 2022. However, now that we've seen January's electric car sales, we know that's incorrect. Electric car sales are more than double in January this year versus what they were in January last year. Another important factor is the expanded range of small offerings. Very important. The tiny Wuling Hongwan Mini EV is not eligible for subsidies, except manufacturing subsidies. But it was still among the best-selling models in China last year, offering an affordable entry point to the market for new customers. Very important. Remember, car ownership in China is still very small in comparison to what it is in the West. Overall, the Chinese electric car market looks set for further growth in 2022, driven by the combined effects of consumer preferences for new model offerings, residual national subsidies, and continued preferential treatment for EVs. At the local level, local subsidies, exclusion from city-level purchase limitation. In Europe, electric car sales increased by nearly 70% in 2021 to 2.3 million, about half of which were plug-in hybrids. While annual growth was slower than in 2020, when sales more than doubled, this took place against the backdrop of an overall European automotive market that had not recovered from the pandemic. Total car sales in 2021 were 25% lower than in 2019. The surge in EV sales in Europe last year was partially driven by new CO2 emission standards and by customers who are demanding EVs at a rate that's astounding, meaning there's enormous delays on many different electric cars globally. Purchase subsidies for EVs were also increased and expanded in most major European markets. Monthly sales in 2021 were highest in the last quarter of the year, peaking in December when European sales of electric cars surpassed diesel vehicles for the first time in history with a 21% market share. Well, that's actually not correct. They didn't surpass them for the first time in history because actually we used to have electric cars more than 100 years ago when we didn't have diesel cars at all. In absolute terms, the largest electric car market in Europe in 2021 was Germany, where more than 1 in 3 new cars sold in November and December was electric. More than 1 in 3. Overall, electric cars accounted for 17% of total European sales in 2021. But there were significant differences across markets. In Norway, it was 72%. It's now at 85%. Sweden and the Netherlands at 45% and 30% respectively sat atop global rankings. At 25%, Germany had by far the highest market share among large European markets, followed by the United Kingdom and France, both at around 15%. Italy 8.8%, and Spain 6.5%. The US made an incredible return to the electric car market in 2021 as sales more than doubled to surpass. The overall US car market recovered as well, but electric cars doubled their share to 4.5%. So what happens if we double electric car sales this year in the United States? Well, we hit nearly 10% of the entire market. And what happens if we double the next year? We hit nearly 20%. You can see where this is going. And we double the next year, 40%. And then we double the next year. Well, a few doublings is all we need. It might not take as long as people think. The US market is still mostly dominated by Tesla, which accounts for more than half of all electric vehicles sold. Tesla's market share nonetheless declined from 65% in 2020 as new electric models were offered by other automakers. Federal incentives programs were not renewed, but consumers can still benefit from tax credits, except for Tesla and General Motors, who don't qualify for them at all and haven't for some time now. That hasn't affected their sales though, which is quite remarkable. Despite impressive growth in major markets, the sales of electric cars are not advancing at the same pace globally. China, Europe, and the United States account for roughly 2/3 of the overall car market, but around 90% of electric car sales. In most other markets, electric cars account for less than 2% of overall sales. And in large developing economies such as Brazil, India, and Indonesia, the share is below 1% without any significant increase over the past year. However, While sales of electric scooters and buses are expanding in these countries drastically, the price premium attached to electric cars and a lack of charging infrastructure are key reasons for the sluggish uptake. In Japan, electric car sales barely changed, with their market share remaining below 1% over the past 3 years. That could be thanks to their automakers, the legacy auto companies in Japan, barely producing any EVs at all for local consumers to buy. Korea and Australia showed the greatest dynamism among smaller markets. In Korea, electric car sales more than doubled in 2021 after 2 years without any growth, increasing their market share to 8%. Electric car sales in Australia also more than tripled in 2021, albeit from a low baseline, bringing their market share to around 2.5%. However, the problem here in Australia is not demand, it is supply. There are massive waiting lists for many different electric cars, and many are not offered in Australia because Europe and China just can't get enough of them. Government policies remain the key driving force for global electric car markets, but their dynamism in 2021 also reflects a very active year on the part of the automotive industry. Announcements, targets, and new model launches have helped strengthen the view that the future of cars is 100% electric. At the same time, the huge success of electric vehicles was challenged by tight supplies for components and batteries, and increases in the price of bulk materials such as lithium, cobalt, and nickel, bringing supply-side concerns to the top of the agenda for government and industry alike. Over the course of 2020 and 2021, many governments set targets to phase out sales of internal combustion engine cars within the next 2 decades, as did several car manufacturers. Electric vehicles have become the road transport technology of choice for many governments and the automotive industry. The US government announced in November 2021 an ambitious 50% electrification target for new cars by 2030. This was supported by the announcement of the installation of 500,000 charging points to help increase consumer confidence. In Europe, the EU Commission proposed to bring the CO2 emission standard for new cars to zero by 2035. In other words, all vehicles in Europe have to be fully electric in 2035, bar none. At the same time, several automakers announced electrification targets. For example, Volkswagen said that half of its sales would be electric by 2030. Ford said it expects 40 to 50% of its sales to be electric by the end of the decade, but it keeps on changing its numbers. So I'm going to guess that that number will be significantly higher by the time we get to, say, 2025, for example. Another significant milestone in 2021 was the statement by Toyota, the largest car manufacturer in the world, announcing new investments aimed at achieving electric car sales of 3.5 million a year by 2030. Toyota basically admitted it would go bankrupt if it did not transition to electric cars. And it said the state of the Japanese automotive industry was in serious crises, with the likelihood that everyone going electric would mean that these companies would lose hundreds of thousands of jobs and billions of dollars. So who were the leaders last year in electric car sales? Number 1, we have Tesla. Number 2 was Volkswagen Group. And number 3 was BYD. And it looks set. It looks likely that those 3 players will remain in those positions by the end of 2022 as well. The embracing of electric cars by incumbent car manufacturers is likely to have strong repercussions for the market, as manufacturers sharpen their electrification strategies to compete for market share rather than considering EVs mostly as policy compliance vehicles, which is what they've been doing for the last couple of years. We will see more resources devoted to advertising, increasingly aggressive pricing, and the development of ever more attractive electric models. Just think of that. Think of how much better electric cars are going to be when everyone is all in on them in 5 years' time. At the end of 2020 and throughout 2021, several new EV-only and new generation plug-in hybrid models were released that were designed from the start to be electric vehicles rather than electrified versions of existing conventional cars. These models benefited from manufacturers' increasing experience of electric vehicle design. Compared with the previous generation, they typically offered longer ranges, vehicle designs optimized for electric powertrains, and better value for consumers, and less weight, and the lack of a transmission tunnel, and many other benefits. In Europe, Volkswagen introduced the ID series, while Stellantis presented new, smaller EV-only models. In the US, Ford introduced the new Mach E, and Stellantis and Toyota each launched a new plug-in hybrid model. In the US and Europe, many of the new models that contributed to higher EV sales were premium vehicles. In China, premium EV-only vehicles produced by Chinese startups accounted for 300,000 vehicles sold. But the best-selling electric vehicle in China was the Wuling Hongwan Mini EV with 400,000 sold in 2021. Overall, the introduction of new electric models across different segments of the car market is likely to continue to stimulate demand. The success of the Ford F-150 Lightning and the Cybertruck is a good example, with 200,000 orders for the F-150 pickup and 1.3 million for the Tesla Cybertruck. This has led to Ford increasing its production targets on 3 separate occasions. However, electric cars do face an increasingly challenged supply chain environment. This will benefit some and hurt others, depending on what their strategies are. The future looks bright though for electric cars, but there are warning signals coming from their supply chain, with bulk material prices increasing for the entire auto industry. In 2021, the price of steel rose by as much as 100%, aluminium around 70%, and copper more than 33%, affecting both conventional and electric cars. For electric cars, additional challenges were posed by increased prices for materials needed to manufacture the core component, the battery. The price of lithium carbonate increased by 150% year on year, graphite by 15%, and nickel by 25%, to name just a few. For the time being though, and perhaps surprisingly, volume-weighted average battery prices have not increased since 2020, for good reason. 3 factors explain the steady prices. Firstly, battery prices are on a long-term decline trajectory, and continued technological progress helped offset the higher raw material costs. Secondly, there is a time lag between material price spikes and battery price increases, as costs take time to work their way through the value chain. Thirdly, the use of lithium iron phosphate chemistries in batteries, or LFP, has increased, reducing the impact of some of the price rises. However, if battery metal prices continue to rise, battery prices will be affected. Several automakers also faced microchip shortages that held back output. The background to the microchip shortage is complex, but in general, a faster than anticipated rebound of automobile sales and other microchip reliant products was met by a tight supply of microchips. The shortage is problematic for EVs, which require around twice as many chips as equivalent conventional vehicles, mostly due to additional power electronics components. It is possible that without these disruptions, electric car sales would have been even higher in 2021. Several EV factory lines were mothballed for weeks, causing delays in the delivery of EVs. But somehow, many of the startups weren't affected at all. Now, while some of the supply constraints of 2021 will ease as the market rebalances, others will linger. The EV value chain proved to be robust in 2021, as it managed to deliver on higher than anticipated demand. But for EVs to continue their growth trajectory, battery supply chains and EV production capacity will have to expand at a rapid rate. Both short-term demand and long-term ambition have skyrocketed over the last 2 years, but supply chains have struggled to keep pace. As highlighted in last year's IEA special report on the role of critical minerals in clean energy transitions, the world faces potential shortages of lithium and cobalt as early as 2025 unless sufficient investments are made to expand production, which I believe will happen. Further growth of EVs requires not only an expansion of the extraction of key materials and minerals, but also the entire EV supply chain. This spans battery metal processing and refining, cathode and anode manufacturing. Remember my video talking about Tesla's cathode and anode manufacturing plant at Gigafactory, Texas? Consider the importance of that based on this IEA report. Separator manufacturing, cell production, battery assembly, and finally the assembly of electric vehicles. Each of these industries, some of which are nascent, need to expand rapidly to avoid bottlenecks that would slow down the transition to full electric mobility. Car manufacturers need to get supply now for the future. EVs are set to enter a new phase in which raw material and component supply come to the fore of policymaking as critical elements of the clean energy transition. For the first time, supply-side bottlenecks are becoming a real challenge to the electrification of road transport and adding to traditional demand-side challenges. Policy action must adapt and provide the market with clear long-term signals to facilitate investments in further supply-side expansions. Clearly, the Chinese government are doing this now. Our other governments, though, not as much. The latest US infrastructure bill aimed at stimulating investments in raw battery materials, or the EU's important projects of common European interest emphasis on batteries are examples of such new focuses. But are they enough? These and other key aspects will be further analysed in the IEA's edition of the Global Electric Vehicle Outlook in spring, which I'll report on as well. How the transition to EVs plays out over the coming decade is being determined by today's actions by government and industry. The path ahead has several new challenges that need to be tackled. Policies to stimulate demand are increasingly successful at convincing consumers to purchase electric vehicles, especially when the cost of ownership is so much lower. However, as the transition processes, governments must not abruptly change the incentive structures in place. Rather, incentives and subsidies must transition to more targeted and financially sustainable tools. The expansion of the battery industry can put strains on the material supply chain. Governments will need to set out clear policy frameworks and foster international collaboration to ensure that all the required investments are made on time and in an environmentally and socially sustainable way to ensure a growing EV industry. As the share of EVs increases, so will the need for charging infrastructure. The current impetus on sales can only be sustained if ever larger shares of the population have access to convenient and affordable charging infrastructure. Governments will have to facilitate investment in this sector by minimizing all market and non-market barriers to roll out charging infrastructure. Fortunately, this is being done very heavily by the private sector right now, but government should support this more heavily as well. Now, much of this video was provided by the IEA's report, or the International Energy Agency. I just want to point out a fact you should consider. The IEA is often wrong. They're often very wrong. They're very conservative on one thing, their predictions. Their predictions for change. Their predictions for change are always slow and conservative, because that's what they are as a company, conservative. Realistically, it's likely that all the predictions made here will happen much faster than the IEA says. Why? Because every year for the past 20 years, they have underpredicted on a series of things, including the transition to renewables and the transition to electric cars, which will happen much quicker than almost anyone thinks. Thanks for watching the channel, and I'll see you again on the next video. Bye-bye.